So today's daf for our purposes is daf Chaf Dalid. We're going to start on Chaf Gimel and base 2 lines before the end of the daf. And we learned in the Mishnah that if a person is Mekadesh 2 sisters and he has 2 brothers, now there's a suffix which one of the 2 sisters he was married to. So the law was that one of his brothers would give chalitza, the other would give yibum. And if they both instead were miyabim her, then ein motziyim miyad. We're not going to bust up the marriage, so to speak. So the Gemara asks, "Mai shno mehadisnan." We're going to quote a Mishnah later on in Chavav, and there we do bust up the marriage. Arba achim shnayim mehem nisuin l'shtei achios. So you have 4 brothers that 2 of the brothers are married to 2 sisters. Umesu, Hanasuos, Hanasuin ela achios. So those 2 brothers that were married to the 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah, they died, and their 2 wives, respectively, Rachel and Leah, 2 sisters, fall for Yibum in front of the 2 remaining brothers, the surviving brothers. And we have halacha here of blocking Yibum. And the reason for blocking the Yibum is because of the prohibition of Achos Zukukaso, which is like Achos Ishto. And the Mishnah records the opinion of Beis Hillel that Kadmu V'Kantu Yetzu, that if they went ahead and they were miyabem, then we have to force them to divorce their wives. We have to break up the marriage. So that's against our Mishnah, which says Kadmo v'Kanso ein motziyim miyad. We could allow the marriage to go on. And the Gemara rejects this analogy outright. Pachi hashta, meaning there's no comparison between the 2 cases. And here we start today's daf, Chav Dalid. Hasam, in the case of 4 achim, I lemanti amar yesh sika, whether or not we go according to that Mandiyama who says yesh zika. So therefore the zikas hayavam makes these kukal yavam like an eshes hayavam. It's ke ishus dami. And that's going to generate an iser of achos kukaso, which is like achos ishto. And according to that shita that holds yesh zika, the reason why our Mishnah says choletzes v'lomis yabemes is because the zika of each one of the 2 sisters of Rachel and Leah makes it into Eshes Yavam. And therefore the brothers are blocked from Yibum because in each case she is considered Achos Ishto. So that's the reason why Kadmo V'Kanso Yotziu, that we cannot recognize the marriage, even b'di'evet, we have to bust up the marriage because the violation of Eshes of Achos Ishto, which is really Achos Kukaso in this case. That's called Yesh Zika. So the Isser is a Vadai. There's no question about it that each one of the Achios is Achos Kukaso. That you can't deny that. That's not even a suffix. That's a Vadai. And therefore, if the brothers went ahead and they married these Achios, then we still have that Isser, that sort of like shadow, the dark shadow over their heads. And therefore, even when the Zika is Paka, since at the time of the Nefilah, when the brothers died and the wives, let's say Rachel and Leah respectively, fell for Yibum, there was an Iser of Hs of Achos Ishto, meaning Achos Kukaso, which is like Achos Ishto. So then we generated an Iser of Eshes Achiv. It's like Eshes Achiv that has children. And therefore the din is that Kadmu v'Kantu Yotzi. And if you want to go and interpret the Mishnah according to the Mandiyam who holds that, forget about Yesh Zika. It has nothing to do with Yesh Zika, but rather it's applying the principle of Asur Levatel Mitzvahs Yevamin. So again, as far as the Zika per se is concerned, and the second possibility that we're investigating now, the Zika Sayibum is not chamur, it's not so severe to generate an Iser of Achos Kukaso, which is like Achos Ishta. But the reason for the Iser is because you're not allowed to be Gorem, a bittul of Mitzvahs Yibum. And therefore, we don't want to allow both brothers to be miyabim, each one of the two sisters. Because what could happen is that one of the two Yevamim will die, and then as far as the other achos is concerned, you mavatal the mitzvahs yimum, because there's no one to be choleit or to be miyabim. She's asura, she's prohibited on the Yavam, because he was miyabim her sister, and that's called achos isha. So therefore, the reason why in kadmu v'kantu yotziu we have to bust up the marriage with the evidence, because also levato mitzvahs yevamim. And once again, we apply the same rule that we applied earlier. If you hold yesh zika, and that is that since b'shas nefil v'yibum there was an iser yibum, therefore that iser remains in place, and that's called like eshes ach she'ein lo sheyesh lo banim. But hacha, in conscious in our Mishnah, there's no reason to create such an Isser, because there's only one of the two sisters who's Kukal Yavam. They both in a situation of suffix. We don't know which one of the two was Kuka. He married one of the two sisters. Which one is going to be at Achos Kuka, and which one is this Kuka, has the Zikas Yima. Therefore, if Kadmu v'Kansu, but the Eved, if the two brothers went ahead and they married them, they were mafkia the zika from the two sisters, and there's no longer an iser of tachas baleim. We cannot generate an iser based on the fact that there was one moment of iser, because there was never a moment of iser. It was always a suffix. And now they're no longer omdos iser tachas baleim. So therefore, if they were kadmu v'kansu, they violated an iser of a suffix, but we can allow the marriage to continue. To call chad v'chad emor. With regard to each one of the brothers, we say, Didei ka mitzramule. This was the woman, the one I'm being miyabim now, is the Ashes Ach. She was the one that was married by my brother. She was the one who was kukal yibum. And now he had the opportunity to be miyabim her. He doesn't violate achos kukaso, and therefore ein motzia miyod. So again, the fundamental difference here to summarize is between a vadai achos ishto, or achos kukaso to be more precise, and a suffix. And in the case of suffix, he has the right to say, look, I was miyabima, and therefore I can assume that she was the skuka, and that's the end of the ballgame. Now the Gemara goes on to analyze the Mishnah in a case where two people were Makadesh, two sisters, and we don't know which one of the two sisters was married to which one of the two brothers. Each one of these two brothers has two brothers. Right? All told, you're talking about 6 brothers. And the Mishnah establishes that im cholzu achiv shel echad et shteihen, if, let's say, one of these two sets of brothers, their surviving brothers, gave chalitza to both Rachel and Leah, because again, there was a suffix, which brother married which one of the two, then the Mishnah establishes that the brothers of the other brother, right, because 2 brothers died, they have a din of echad choletz, the echad miyabim. In other words, the yibum arishon could be that she's not Eshes Achim, because we don't know. And therefore, we have a problem of achos kukaso with regard to the second brother of the second set. Kadma v'kanso ein motzi. Tanan, we have a Tani Shiloh. Shiloh was one of the great Amoraim, perhaps even a Tana, and he had a brisa that it says afilu shneim kohanim. Even if 2 of the brothers are kohanim, and then I'll let him marry a chalutza. A kohen is enjoined from marrying a chalutza. Once again, we're going to still apply the principle of ein motziin miyado, and that's a hell of a chiddush, because one of them is definitely marrying a chalutza, right? Because There were two brothers.
One of them has to be Nechlas.
One of them has to be a Chalutza. So the Gemara asks my timer, why is it Ein Motzi Miyodo? If one of them is definitely violating an Iser of Chalutza to a Kohen. Again, let's go over it one more time. Why is there a Vadai Suffolk Chalutza here? In this case, one of the two brothers is marrying a Chalutza, right? Because keep in mind, the two brothers of the other deceased, it was Reuven and Shimon, both died. So the brothers of Reuven both gave Chalitza to both of them, to both Rachel and Leah. One of them definitely is a Chalutza. How can you now tell me that if one of the brothers of Shimon who died was now, and he's a Kohen, was now Makadish her or Miyabim her, the other sister, how can you allow such a marriage to continue? Right? That, let's say if both brothers of the Makadish would now marry these two girls, one of them is definitely a Chalutza. So my timer, so the Gemara answers Chalutza d'Rabbanan, the Torah only prohibited a Kohen from marrying a Grusha. And the Iser of marrying a Chalutza for a Kohen is only d'Rabbanan. With Suffolk, Chalutza lo gazu Rabbanan, where the Rabbanan made this original Gzeira, they only did it to a Vadai Chalutza, not to a Suffolk Chalutza. And now the Gemara wants to really analyze, is it really true that Chalutza is only D'Rabbanan? In fact, the Gemara of a Chalutza D'Rabbanan, Ivatanya, we learned in a Brisa. The Torah addresses the Kohanim in Parshas Emor, and it says, "Ve'isha grusha misha lo yikachu ein li ela grusha chalutza minayin tamilomer ve'isha." So the Gemara is now darshaning the extra word ve'isha to include even a chalutza. So the Gemara answers, no, mirabbanan cross machta bi'almahu. This is only an asmachta. This is not a real drasha gemura doraisa. Now, in the note here, he points out that the Isa Chalutza L'Kohen is actually enumerated and counted amongst the Chayve Lavim, as far as Malchus is concerned, in the Mishnah Masechet Malchus. But that's only called Shigras Halosh. And whenever the Mishnah uses the word Grusha, it adds the word Chalutza. But Chalutza is only D'Rabbanan. Okay, Rabbosai, now we get to the main subject of today. Most of what we did now until this point belongs to yesterday. Just by way of introduction, the Mishnah and the Gemara that we're about to learn address the question of which of the brothers is primarily obligated in Yibum. We know that any of the brothers could be Miyamim, who had in Chalitza, but the Mishnah says mitzvah begadol Yabim. Now, we're not sure what the word gadol means. Either gadol means the oldest of the brothers, or it means the Bukhar. You can have a brother who's the oldest of the brothers because the Bukhar himself may have died without children. Fine, so there's a special role of the oldest of the brothers, a special responsibility vis-a-vis the mitzvah of Yibum. So he gets priority over the younger brothers. However, the Mishnah says, "Im kadam hakatan v'yibem," we'll add that word, zacha. He was kona, his yevama, even though the primary responsibility and the first dibs was on the shoulders of the gadol, his older brother. Nevertheless, if the katan, again, we're not talking about a katan who's less than bar mitzvah, we're talking about a katan in terms of his relative age to the gadol, and Zacha means he was Kona, his Yevamot. Again, he shouldn't have done such a thing. L'chatchila, he violated and undermined the mitzvah of the gadol, but with the Eved, if he married her, then the marriage is valid. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa. Now, this Brisa is going to analyze a pasuk in the Parsha of Yibum and darshan it from three different perspectives. The pasuk says, in Parshas Yibum, that's in Kitetse, V'hoya b'chor asher teled Yaakov al shem achiv. Now, again, when I read this pasuk, V'hoya b'chor asher teled, I understand that that's after the Yibum was implemented and the wife, the Yevamot, had a child, and we call the child by the name of her late husband. But that's not how this Brisa is going to understand V'hoya habachar. Mikan shemitzvah begadol liyaben. The bachar that we're talking about is not the child that was born after Yibum, but rather the Yavam himself. He is called bachar. So that means if there are a number of brothers, then the gadol gets kedima, he gets priority over all the other brothers. He has the ikar mitzvah is incumbent upon him. And it's quite possible that what the Brisa has in mind here is that if he, the oldest brother, refuses to be miyabim, we can force him to do so. I don't know. Now, the pasuk that came right before this pasuk says, Ulekacha lo leisha v'yidma. So the subject of this pasuk of Ulekacha lo leisha is the Yavam. And therefore the very next pasuk, V'hoya b'char, the word b'char is describing the Yavam, not the firstborn after the Yibum, through the Yibum. Now the pasuk continues. This is drasha number 2. Asher teled, right? It says, V'hoya habachar asher teled. Prat li islandis she'ena yoledis. So clearly, the Brisa is now understanding Asher teled is talking about the mitzvah of Yibum itself. Meaning, Habachar Asher teled is telling me that the Yevamot has to be capable of having a child. Otherwise, there's no mitzvah of Yibum. Which is very strange because you just told me that the beginning of that same phrase in the Torah, V'hoya b'char, is referring to the b'char of the mother of the deceased. And Asher teled, Prat La'aylan is addressing not the mother of the deceased, she's surely not an islandess, but rather the daughter-in-law of that mother-in-law, meaning the wife of the deceased. So there's a very strange, choppy way of learning this pasuk. We shift from one discussion and addressing one case to another case. Very, very choppy. Then the pasuk continues and says, Yaakov al shem achiv. Now, who's the subject of Yaakov al shem achiv? Well, if we want to be consistent with gadol mitzvah, with gadol yavim, then we're talking about the yavam. So that's good, because the Gemara, the Brisa is going to darshan l'nachla, that he, the yavam, will inherit the estate of his deceased brother, because he was mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum. And who is he? The yavam. He is the bechar, the gadol sheba'ach. Now the Brisa asks a question on itself. L'nachla, how do I know that Yaakov al shem achiv is referring to nachla, to the estate and the inheritance laws? O eino el l'shem. Maybe it means Yaakov al shem achiv, that the name that's given to the child who is born to this Yibum is going to be the name of his deceased. What would it be to him? His deceased uncle, right? So again, now we're shifting back to the child of the Yavam. The Bechar was the Yavam himself, and now we're suggesting Yakum al Shem is addressing not the Yavam, but the child that's born after or through the Yibum. Yosef, if the deceased brother's name was Yosef, Koren also Yosef. We're going to call the child Yosef. If the deceased name was Yochanan, Koren also Yochanan. So the Bryce is basically asking now two questions. Number one, how do you really know and derive that the mitzvah of Yibum is on the Gadol? Because V'hoya B'char Asher Telev is referring not to the Yavam, who's called the B'char because he's the oldest, but rather to the child that's born from the Yibum. And question number two, how do we know that the Yavam inherits his late brother? Maybe the pasuk means that we should just call him by his name. If he was Yosef, we'll call him Yosef. It doesn't tell you anything about the inheritance laws. And the Brisa offers the following answer. This is what's called the Gzeira Shava. Nemar kan Yakum al Shem Achiv. The Nemar lahalon. I'm not sure what the word lahalon means. Usually it means further on. But here he's referring back to a pasuk in Bereishis. So we're going from Dvarim backwards to Bereishis. We're rewinding. Al Shem Acheim Yikaru Benachlasam. It's at the very end of Sefer Bereishis. Now, Al Shema Acheim, almost the identical words of Al Shema Achiv, is referring to Nachla because it says so beferish in the pasuk. Yakum Al Shem Achiv. I'm sorry. Al Shem Acheim Yikaru Benachlasam. So we see that Al Shem is referring to Nachla, and therefore we plug this back into the parsha of Yavam. And in Yibum it says Yakum Al Shem Achiv. It means Lenachla. Ma Shem Ha'omer Lahalon Lenachla. Shem Ha'omer Kan in Yibum Lenachla. Now the Bryce has another drush. V'lo yimachesh shmo prat l'saris sheshmo mochli. Interesting. Now we're introducing another subject to the same pasuk. Who's the subject now? The deceased brother. And v'lo yimachesh shmo is referring back to the deceased brother. That's simple shot in the pasuk anyway. I don't need a drasha for that. Lo yimachesh shmo means his name will not be lost to oblivion. But as far as Asaris, if he died Asaris, then Shmo Machui, we know he has no children because he cannot have children. So he doesn't generate a mitzvah of Yibum if he dies. Rava comments that he derives a radical chiddush from this brisa as far as the power and the authority of a Gzeira Shava. Amar Rava, the overriding principle in interpreting any pasuk in the Torah is, quote, ein mikra yotzi midei pshuto, unquote. But hacha asoy Gzeira Shava v'apikte mipashtei legam. The Gzeira Shava is so powerful that it completely undermines the simple, straightforward meaning of the pasuk. I mean, ayin tachas ayin, right? We have a Kabbalah that we don't read it as an eye for an eye, but rather moment. So there is such a thing as Torah Shabbal Peh, completely undermining the Pshuto Shel Mikra. And here, says Rav, we have an example of a Gzeira Shava that completely undermines the simple pshat in the pasuk. Because when it says Kriyat Shem in this parasha, it means the L'chora, I mean, according to Pshat Pashut, the name of the deceased. That this new baby from the Yibum should be called Al Shem Achiv Shemes. But now we're interpreting it totally different. And we're saying based on this Gzeira Shava, because we see the word Al Shem with regard to Nachala, we're going to interpret this Al Shem here in Yibum Al Shem HaNachla, and it means that the person who was Miyabim, he inherits the shame. He, so to speak, picks up the shame of his late brother as far as the estate is concerned. So the Gemara is now wondering, Ilav Gzeira Shava, what are you telling me, Rava, that if not for this Gzeira Shava, which completely undermines the simple shot, Hava, I would have read it, that shame means shame mamish. That we have to give the baby, the Torah is enjoining us to give the newborn babe the name of the deceased. Well, who's the Torah talking to? Who's the Torah addressing? You're telling me, Rava, that this Pshuto Shel Mikra here, and it's referring to the child born from the Yibum? L'man kol mazer rachmana. Let's go through the possibilities. Who is the Torah addressing and extorting him, or shall we say, imposing upon him the obligation to give the name of the deceased? LeYavam. You want to tell me that it's the father, meaning the Yavam? Then Yakom al Shem Achicha Miboile. In other words, the pasuk is addressing the Yavam. So why does it say Yakom al Shem Achiv? It should have said Yakom al Shem Achicha, which is called Lashon Nochach, when you talk to a person first person. Ve'ila Bezdin, and if the Torah is now addressing the Bezdin and imposing a mitzvah on the Bezdin to guarantee that they call the name of the Ben after Achi Aviv, is Yaakov al Shem Achi Aviv mi boile. It should have said al Shem Achi Aviv. If that's the Azhar on Bezdin, it doesn't make sense to say Achiv. It should have said al Shem Achi Aviv, because the name now is from his uncle, where Shem Achiv doesn't sound like an uncle. So therefore, we have no choice but to interpret the pasuk that's referring the pasuk that's Kriyat Shem. We have to say it refers to Nachla. We can't understand the Pshuto Shel Mikra here without introducing the Gzeira Shava of Nachla. So the Gemara now wants to defend Rava that there could be a Pshuto Shel Mikra. Dilma, how do you fit this into the pasuk Yakom al Shem Achiv? Hachi Kamer lo Rachmana leBezdin. The Torah is actually addressing Bezdin. Imru leili Yavam. You instruct the Yavam, right, the new father, that Yakom al Shem Achiv, that he should guarantee that he calls the name of the baby same name of the deceased. So that would be Pshuto Shel Mikra, and the Torah is talking to Bezdin, who's in turn talking to the Yavam, and this is what Bezdin is obligated to tell the Yavam. Ella, but now that we have a Gzeira Shava, Fikte Ligamri, and it doesn't mean Kriyat Shem, but rather it means Nachla. Come on, ask the following kasha. Hashta diamrit kra begadol ksiv. Now you're telling me that the Bechar mentioned here in this pasuk is referring to the oldest of the brothers. Ema, we should derive the conclusion that Bechar liyamin, Pashat lo liyamin. If the Torah says that the Bechar should be miyamin, it means none of the other brothers could be miyamin. And we know that's not true. I mean, the Mishnah itself says that if the younger one grabs the opportunity and is miyabim her is zacha, he fulfilled the mitzvah of Yibum. So the Gemara answers him, Cain, if only the Bechar is allowed to be miyabim, but not what's called a pashut, is Eishes Achiv Shel Hoy Ba'olam the Mir Rachman Alamali. Why do I need a special mute? Yeshvu Achim Yachtav. They both have to overlap and be alive at the same time. You're talking about Achiv. You're kind to from the pasuk. You're excluding Achiv Shel Hoy Ba'olam. The Achiv Shel Hoy Ba'olam by definition is a katan. There was never a Havamina therefore that he could be miyabim. Why do you need a drasha to exclude Achiv Shelo Hoya B'Olamo? Forget about it. Achiv Shelo Hoya B'Olamo, by definition, he wasn't alive at the time of the misa of his brother. So therefore, he couldn't possibly be considered a potential Yavam. He can't be a potential Yavam because you're telling me that the only Yavam is the Bechar. He's not the Bechar. So the final conclusion now at this point in the Gemara is for sure there's no din yibum dafka lebechar. There's got to be a din yibum for the pashut, and then we're going to exclude from the by virtue of Yechach Miachtav Achiv Shelo Hoya B'Olam. Orech Rav Acha. So Rav Acha is still going to insist that only the Bechar can be miyabim. The Ema, and then you'll ask me, if only the Bechar can be miyabim, why do I need a special pasuk to exclude Achiv Shelo Hoya B'Olamo? He's not the Bechar, clearly. L'ma'ute Buchra de'ima. So you can have a case of a younger brother who's also called a Bechar. Again, if there were two, the same man was married to two wives, and he's a Bechar to his mother. So he gives an example here. It's a complicated example. I'll just mention it. I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty details. I don't think it's necessary. He says, Kigon Avram married Sarah. And from that marriage, they had a child named Reuven. Reuven marries Rivka and he dies without any children. Then Avram marries Rachel. And they have a child named Shimon. Shimon is a Bechar le'imo, below la'aviv. The Achiv Shel Reuven me'aviv, and Shimon is a paternal brother to Reuven. Shimon should have been miyabim Rivka, if not for the fact that he was born after the death of Reuven. And now we could say that the Torah needed to exclude Eishes Achiv Shel Hoya B'Olamo in a case of a Bechar le'ima. So Gemara rejects that outright. Who, in the case of Bechar le'im, we're talking about Nachla now. Lo Motzes Amar, you can't interpret that that we need an exclusion from Bechar le'imo. You don't need an exclusion for Bechar le'imo because Nachla, ben Nachla tolu Rachmana, ben Nachla min ha'av, v'lo min ha'em. Right, the Torah is talking about Nachla here, who inherits the deceased. That can't be min ha'em. There's no such thing as becoming an heir to inherit if you're not Bechar mi of it. So the Gemara asks me, Ema, I'ika Bechar Tiskaya Mitzvah Sibum, Ki Leka Bechar Lo Tiskaya Mitzvah Sibum. Right now that you're telling me that V'haya Bechar Asher Teled is addressing the Bechar, so maybe it means that if there's a Bechar, we have a mitzvah of Hebrew. If there's no Bechar, then we don't have a mitzvah of Hebrew. The entire thrust of this mitzvah is incumbent upon the Bechar. The Gemara answers, Hamakra umeis echad mehem. There were two brothers, one of whom died. Umilo askinon demis Bechar v'yomer achmana liyabim katan. So it means that even though the Bechar died, because it says umeis echad mehem, and it's very possible that it means the Bechar died, nevertheless the Torah says to be miyabim. So you see that even a katan is obligated in Yibum under certain circumstances. And even though the Bechar is not around, he's not alive anymore, nevertheless, there still is a mitzvah Yibum. So the Gemara asks, the Ema de Miskatan. The Torah says, V'haya ha-Bechar, which implies that the mitzvah of Yibum is incumbent upon the Bechar. The Bechar is alive and well. So the Gemara says, "V'ema de miskatan amar Rachmana liyabim bechar." If there is a bechar alive, and the katan died, then you could have a mitzvah of yibum. So if there were two surviving brothers, and one of them was a cut, one was a gadol, the gadol is called a bechar, and the Torah is telling us that in this case, the bechar is what? Is miyabem. So again, we're trying to figure out why do we need an exclusion for Eishes Achus Lamo. So maybe the younger brother was born after the death. Let's say Levi, we'll call it, was born after the death of Reuven. Right? And the Torah is saying, just 1 second. There's so many different questions here in the Gemara, one after the other. The Ema de Miskatan. I'm going to read here the Masifta. Af shebepashtus mashmash ha-posuk medaber chol ofen, af bi ofen shemeis ha-gadol. Shemiyabim ha-katan. And that's what we just said before. Milo ma'askinon de meis bechar. The Amar Rachmana liyabim. The katan should be miyabim, even though he's not a bechar. So the Gemara now asks, the aim of the miskatan. So again, if the gadol dies, let the katan be miyabim, but the pasuk says v'haya bechar, and now the bechar died. So how could you say v'haya bechar? Bechar means he's alive. So the katan died. Right, there are two brothers. The katan died, but the bechar is still alive. And Amar Rachmana liyabim bechar. So what's the bottom line here? That if we read the pasuk in a way that the Torah is telling us that although the katan could be miyabim, but the Torah is saying that even if the katan died, one second. we said that if the gadol dies, then the katan is miyavin. The ema the miskatan, right? Since the pasuk says v'haya b'char, it means that there is a b'char alive. But we said that the b'char died, and the katan is miyavin. But maybe it's just the opposite. Not that if the b'char died, the katan is miyavin, but maybe the Torah is telling us that if the b'char dies, then there's no mitzvah of yibum, because the Torah commands the yavam to do the yibum. So how do you know? This is what I think the Gemara is asking now. How do you know that even in the absence of the b'char, if he died, there still is a mitzvah incumbent upon the katan? Maybe the Torah is telling the Amar Achmana liyabim b'char that the b'char is the exclusive miyabim, and if the b'char is no longer alive, the mitzvah of yabim goes down to oblivion. So Gemara rejects this. We had a special pasuk from which we learned Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya B'Olama, which is the case of an ach katan, right? He has to be an ach katan. He was born after the death of his brother. So you see that there's a mitzvah of yibum even on b'no katan, and therefore, if the b'char is not alive anymore, there certainly should be an obligation of yibum incumbent upon the katan as long as he was haya b'olam. So we're now asked the ema. Perhaps we should say that the mitzvah of yibum applies dafka to a b'char, and kilek a b'char kadam katan zacha. If the b'char is no longer alive, then if the katan went ahead and was miyabim, and he was koted, he was zoch, because there's no b'char. But a yika b'char, maybe what the Torah is telling me is that if there's a b'char who's alive and well, is then kadam hayavam hakatan v'yibim lo zoch. So we're going to come to a very strange conclusion, and that is that if the b'char is alive, then the katan cannot be zocha. He's, in a sense, usurping the role of the gadol. Gemara rejects that too. From this hekesh of Yachdav, we derive the conclusion that all the brothers are equally obligated in the mitzvah of yibum. So therefore, it's impossible to maintain that conclusion that if there is a b'char who could be Mekayim the mitzvah of yibum, then the pashut is not given the mitzvah, the possibility of being Mekayim the mitzvah of yibum. Gemara now asks the ema. Maybe we should say that as long as the b'char is alive and the mitzvah of yibum could be fulfilled through the b'char, and through the pshutim as well. But ki ika b'char liheder agadol. If the b'char is alive, then leheder agadol. What's leheder agadol mean? So here we have Rashi, we have the Orch Ner, whole business here, but we'll take the simple pshat that leheder agadol means we can force the gadol to be miyabed. So it means like that. If the yavam is willing to be miyabed up front, fine. If he doesn't, then we turn to the other achim, and in event that they too refuse to be mekayim the mitzvah, even then we go back to the gadol and we force him, we compel him to be miyabed, because he has the ikar mitzvah, not the other brothers. But ki leka b'char, if there's no b'char, ain't chosin eitzel gadol. What does that mean? Ein chosrim eitzel gadol. No, it's maybe the pasuk is referring after to a bechar, firstborn, not to the older brother, but to the bechar. And if there is no bechar, then there's no special status here to the gadol sheba'ach. There's no mitzvah on the gadol, there's a mitzvah on the bechar. And aloma tani abai kshisha mitzvah begadol yavim. So you see clearly that Abai holds that there's a special mitzvah incumbent upon the older brother. Lo ratza, if the older brother, the gadol should be Yevamot, doesn't want to be miyab holchem eitzalach bakad, they go to the next one. Lo ratza, if he doesn't want to chozun eitzal gadol, we go back to the gadol and we force him and coerce him to do yibum because he has the obligation of yibum above and beyond the other brothers. So you see clearly that if the older brother doesn't want to do yibum, we go to the achav hakatan, meaning a brother that's younger than him. He may be older than the other brothers, but he's younger than this oldest brother. And this is an application of the rule that basically gadol kodem. We go according to the ages of the brothers. But we see that it doesn't depend upon bechora. It depends upon gadlus. And how does the Brisa know that? The Torah says bechar. How do you know that bechar means the gadol? And the answer is kibechar. Ma bechar bechorasa garmalo. Af gadol gedulaso garmalo. So the word bechar here is sort of a metaphor for the oldest brother. So when the Torah uses the word bechar, it doesn't mean dafka bechar. It means he's the gadol of the ach. Like he has special mitzvah of covered because he's the oldest of the brothers. I don't know if that would apply if they're older sisters. I don't know. So there's a kedima not only for the bechar but even for the gadol sheba'ach. So the Gemara now goes back and asks the ema ki miyabem bechar lishkol nachla ki miyabem poshut lo lishkol nachla. Right, the rest of the pasuk says Yakum al Shem Achiv, which means Lagabi Nachla. So maybe when the Torah specifies the Bechar, it means he steps into the shoes of his late brother and inherits his estate. And the reason why the Torah says Bechar is that even though Lagabi, the mitzvah of Yibum, all the brothers are, so to speak, equal one to the other. There's certain equality here. And even a Bechar Pasha could be Mekayim the mitzvah. But as far as the Chiddush of Yavam Yoresh Nichsei Achiv HaMeis, here we don't have a Hekesh between the Yavam and the other brothers. And therefore, Kimiyabim Pasha Lo Lichkol Nachlos, more answers on Makra, Yakum Al Shem Achiv, Varekam. What does that mean, Varekam? He writes here, Kol Misha Kam Al Shem Hames Yoresh also. What does it mean, Shekam al Shem Hames? I guess he's saying that through Yibum, he's in effect replacing the deceased brother of his as far as the marriage with his sister-in-law. So the Gemara says, now that you've established that this halach of gadol sheba'achim, the oldest of the brothers, even though he's not a bechar, is bechar de kairei rachmana l'mai hilchasa. So why did the Torah use the word bechar, which is ambiguous? It's almost misleading.